For the News and Observer, I'm Dawn Vaughan, Capitol Bureau Chief and host of Under the Dome. It's Tuesday. Our podcast moved to a new day. It's springtime now, and you'll hear from us every Tuesday morning with the freshest news. I'm joined today by politics reporters Avi Bajpai and Kyle Ingram, and we're going to talk about guns, the never-ending Supreme Court race, and Governor Stein's budget proposal. Let's start with Kyle and that Supreme Court case news that happened on Friday. So what is the latest turn in this windy road of the election?
Yeah, so this is, of course, Jefferson Griffin's attempt to discard over 65,000 votes that were cast in the November Supreme Court election, which he narrowly lost to Allison Riggs, who is the Democratic incumbent on the Supreme Court. Where we're at right now is that the case has reached the North Carolina Court of Appeals. So a panel of judges on that court heard arguments on Friday. It wasn't really any arguments we haven't already heard before. They're sort of retreading the same disputes, but before a different audience now. So we've got 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat on that panel. Now, they didn't indicate when they'd rule, and they didn't necessarily say how they'd rule, but you had one Republican judge who seemed somewhat sympathetic to Griffin's claims, and 1 Democratic judge who seemed very suspicious of Griffin's claims. The other Republican, we didn't really get a lot of insight from. But this case is almost certainly going to make it all the way up to the Supreme Court for consideration. But why the Court of Appeals matters is because Riggs, who maintains her seat on the court while this happens, has recused herself from the Supreme Court considering it. With her gone, that only leaves 6 justices on the North Carolina Supreme Court who will hear this case. So there's a possibility that they deadlock in a 3-3 split. If that happens, the most recent ruling of a lower court is the prevailing ruling. So this Court of Appeals ruling, long way of saying that, could be the final decision in the case when it comes.
Okay. Well, also on this, you sat down with Jason Simmons, chair of the North Carolina Republican Party, to talk about the case. Why Simmons, and what did Simmons have to say?
Yeah, so this case has been going on for over 4 months now, and throughout that time, Griffin himself has refused to talk to the media. He says that doing so would be a violation of the state's Code of Judicial Conduct. Riggs, of course, has spoken with the media. She's been outspoken about this case and her response to it. But regardless, we wanted to hear more from the other side because all we've really heard from them is what we hear in court. So Griffin isn't actually the only plaintiff in this case. From the very beginning, he brought it alongside the North Carolina Republican Party. So I asked Jason Simmons, the chair of the party, if he would sit down and talk with us about it. So we've got a long interview with him. You can watch the whole thing on our website. But one moment that I wanted to play for you all was this question where I asked him about the biggest bucket of challenged voters, which is these over 60,000 voters who didn't have a driver's license or a social security number in the state's voter registration database. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. The state board has said that there's not necessarily any reason to suspect malfeasance or an ineligible person. So I asked Simmons, this case has been going on for over 4 months. If there's a concern that because those voters lack those numbers, they could be ineligible, why have you still not been able to identify a single person off that list who actually is ineligible? And this is what he said.
I'm very sympathetic to them because, again, they did nothing wrong. What occurred was from the State Board of Elections, where they had an improper form that allowed people to register during that time that did not collect all of the data that was necessary to be able to verify who they are.
All right. Well, you can watch the full interview, read Kyle's story, read all about it, and Kyle's continuing saga of the state Supreme Court race in the News and Observer. We're going to move on to the legislature. And I feel like this past week in the Senate was maybe the most kind of contentious debate we've seen so far this session. It's around a topic that always has that, guns. So, Avi, you've been covering this for a while. It's about concealed carry permit. So if you can quickly explain the bill and then kind of what we saw in the Senate and what this means for the rest of session, really.
Yeah, so right now in the state of North Carolina, if you want to carry a concealed handgun, you have to, first of all, be over the age of 21. You have to get a permit from your sheriff's office. That entails doing an roughly 8-hour long training course, education, basically requirement. and you have to go through a background check, get that permit. Republicans, conservatives, gun rights supporters have been lobbying for a long time now to do away with that permit requirement. So this bill that there's a Senate bill and a House bill. They both were moving at the same time last week, which was interesting. And it ended up passing the Senate, as you mentioned, during this contentious, lengthy floor debate. This bill would basically remove that requirement. So it keeps the permit system in place. If you want to get that permit for use in another state, to buy a gun in another state, that's fine, but you don't need to get that permit just to carry a concealed handgun. And also, this bill lowers the age from 21 to 18. So it's definitely controversial. I mean, we saw this 2 years ago with the pistol purchase permit repeal. That was very controversial.
This is different. I mean, do you know, what does it look like naturally with concealed carry laws? Have you looked at that, or is that something?
Yeah, so the proponents of this say that there are, if this bill is enacted, that North Carolina would become the 30th state in the country to have some form of what they call permitless carry. So it's different. You know, the laws are slightly different across all the different states, but that's their argument. But, you know, we saw a really kind of passion. You know, this issue brings out really strong passion arguments from both sides. Obviously, the proponents, supporters of it, say that this is, you know, people's constitutional right to not have their right to bear arms infringed upon. But obviously, opponents of this, people are concerned about safety, public safety, gun safety. You know, they have a lot of arguments about this too, saying, you know, it's a permit requirement. You have to take a class. They basically argue, you know, there should be some kind of safety consideration when you're
kind of a little bit of training.
Yeah.
You know what? I thought it was interesting with the Senate Democrats. A lot of those who debated are gun owners and talked about their own experiences.
Not just gun owners, but they have this very permit themselves. They mentioned that during the debate. Senate Minority Leader Sidney Batch brought that up. There were other Democrats who mentioned their personal experience going through this permit process, saying that it's not, kind of contesting the Republican argument that it's burdensome, that's too much of of an infringement on people's rights to easily access and use guns. And you know what stood out to me was that there were many amendments. There were, I think, in total, when you count the Democratic amendments and then some of the Republican substitute amendments, it was something like 15 or 16 amendments. It was a lengthy debate, and what stood out to me was this strategy, it seemed, by Democrats to, obviously they had, you know, a group of amendments, changes they want to make to the bill that were kind of non-starters. Everyone in the room knew that it wasn't going to be taken up. So they had their reasons for kind of countering the Republican argument on this whole issue with those amendments. But then there were two from Senator Mujtaba Muhammad of Charlotte that were the first two. They were quickly, the Republicans took a quick break to discuss them and then quickly came back. Senator Dane Britt, who's the main sponsor of this bill, came back and said, we're good with this, basically to increase the line of duty death benefit for police officers and also to create a scholarship for the kids of police officers who were killed. And I thought that was really interesting that, it's kind of Democrats suggesting that this bill is actually going to harm public safety, make it more dangerous for police officers, and Republicans saying, well, we totally vehemently disagree with that. But if you want to go ahead and increase these benefits for police officers, let's go ahead and do that.
It was an interesting sort of political play there, as far as adding that and, if you can't vote against it, but then also bringing more attention to what they're doing. So that's definitely something to watch and how the Senate works. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll wrap up any loose ends from this debate, talk about the budget odds, and then our picks for headliner of the week. We'll be right back. You're listening to Under the Dome. I'm Capitol Bureau Chief Dawn Vaughan here with Avi Bajpai and Kyle Ingram. Before the break, we were talking about the Senate debate on concealed carry bill and really the strategy that we might see going forward in the Senate. Democrats are in the super minority party. Just as far as how things might end up on the floor. And of course, Senator Sidney Batch is the new Senate Democratic leader. She won the election from the caucus after longtime Senate leader Dan Blue.
Yeah. So, I mean, just building off of what we were talking about with those amendments, I asked Senator Berger, the leader, Republican leader, and then also the Democrats afterwards about what went down with those amendments. Because it's not often that you see, a lot of times when we have contentious bills in the past, it's kind of like by the time the bill gets to the floor, the arguments have been made several times, especially in committees, that it's just kind of Republicans make their closing pitch and want to move forward to the vote, and Democrats have a couple of things, usually kind of like messaging things that they want to add to the discussion. It's a little rare, I think, to see substantive amendments get unanimous approval. Both sides, Republicans, they buy in from them and they come in and vote for it. So I asked Senator Berger about that. He said that, even on some of these contentious bills going forward, it's possible if Republicans think it's a good idea that they would, support it. So I think that that's something to look ahead to. If this is something we see as a continued strategy by Democrats, even if they want to, if their mind is made up on voting against a bill, if they try to, as Senator Mohammed said, reduce the harm of it, in his opinion, make some tweaks to it, that'll be something interesting to watch.
Okay. Well, speaking of Berger, Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger, an Eden Republican, is arguably the most powerful politician in the state. And cohorts, the three are, Democratic Governor Josh Stein and House Speaker Destin Hall. Of course, Berger has been around longer than them and his particular leadership position. So Stein made his budget proposal this past week, which is really just you throw your ball out there and see if what the legislature is going to do. Some of it is what you want to represent from your party. Some of it is, obviously spend time with the Office of State Budget and Management to decide what would the actual cost be and what do you want. What stood out to me was Stein's, relatively low 2% pitch for raises for state employees, which is a little more about what Republicans have pitched in the past. House Speaker Hall said that he would want higher than 2% raises. We'll see what the Senate does. Of course, you ask Berger. Berger doesn't tell you anything. No, Berger decides he's going to tell you something. But there are some things that are just non-starters. And the biggest one is that Stein wants to have a moratorium on private school vouchers. And Speaker Hall literally said, that's a non-starter. So that's not something that's going to change. That is a lot of money. It's the Opportunity Scholarship Program, which is parents who don't send their kids to North Carolina public schools can take some of that taxpayer money and give it to the private schools, which don't obviously have the same oversight of state. It's a big argument that I think most listeners are already well versed in. So that's the big no. The other is the different take on taxes. Stein wants to freeze the current tax cuts, which is reducing the individual income tax rate and the corporate income tax rate, and wants to have carve out credits more for working families, tax credits for childcare. That doesn't seem like it's going to go anywhere. Republicans have decided this is their tax policy. They're going to keep that tax policy. One of other Stein's pitches was to bring back the sales tax holiday for back to school shopping, which North Carolina had for a long time, and then they got rid of. And Hall said, well, he hasn't talked to the caucus yet, so maybe that's something that ends up moving. Really what we need to look at money-wise is after, tax day is April 15th, after we all, pay the federal government and the state government what they require. Then in May, we get those numbers of what the state revenue is, and that's a key factor in the budget. Berger also told reporters on the floor this past week that the Senate's goal, and it's the Senate's turn to put their budget out this time, would be to pass it that week before Easter. So April 17th, I believe, is that Thursday. But that's if the House and Senate, basically Berger and Hall, can agree on the total spend number, which is not in statute. It's just something they like to do. And that's usually the argument of, the Senate wants to spend less and the House wants to spend more. And they're trading those negotiations now. And if that happens, then the Senate budget could come out before they take a week break after Easter, which is April 20th. And then there's also talk that the House plans its budget for the end of May before they also take a break. I think that's Memorial Day.
Yeah, end of May, last week of May.
Okay. So anyway, plenty of budget stuff to go. Moving on to our picks for headliner of the week. Avi, yours is about legislative bill signing, so let's start with you.
Yeah, the first bill that was sent to Governor Stein's desk, a little more than $500 million, and the fourth bill that lawmakers have passed for Helene relief. And specifically, my headliner is the fact that, this has been, the recovery from this devastating storm and its impacts. There's been some contentiousness over this, over different parts of the response at the state level, the federal level. And it was just notable to me that this was, Governor Stein came and said during his speech a couple of weeks ago that he was just raring to go to sign this bill. So he wanted it yesterday, as he said. And he had that bill signing within a few hours of when the Senate concurred, signed off on the conference report on this thing. And then there was a bipartisan bill signing ceremony, and there were a number of lawmakers from Western North Carolina, members of leadership. Speaker Hall was there. So it was a kind of notable moment of bipartisanship, of executive branch and legislative branch camaraderie. And that was notable to me. And I'm just going to be waiting to see, looking forward to seeing, how that kind of relationship continues between the governor and legislative leaders, specifically Republicans.
Well, speaking of bipartisanship, I think it's very bipartisan. My headliner is basketball and bracketology. And my brackets, both at the NNO and in my husband's office pool, were just total trash, destroyed. But I do have Duke picking so I'm not completely out of the running. My local allegiance is Duke. I have Duke pick. Berger said that he picked Duke. Stein picked Duke. So I know I'm sitting with some big three. Yeah, and so I can't remember. Hall put his out. I can't remember what he picked. I'm sitting at the table here with UNC alum Kyle Ingram and producer Laura Bajpai. So maybe they don't agree that Duke should win. But anyway, I'm glad that they're still in it as of Monday. Anyway. All right, Kyle, who or what is your headliner of the week?
My headliner happened just as we sat down to record this today. As we were getting ready, Dawn over here goes to find a piece of paper at the desk. And while we're all sitting, we just are jolted awake by a scream. Oh, God! So that was our Capitol Bureau Chief, Dawn Vaughan, seeing a fake roach on the table here that I believe our photo staff left behind. So great to see that work out the way it was intended to.
Who doesn't want to start their week on Monday seeing what looked like a giant gross bug at your work? So yeah, gross. All right, to end on that note, I'm Dawn Vaughan for Kyle Ingram, Avi Bajpai, producer Laura Bajpai. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you right back here next Tuesday.
For more from our politics team, subscribe to the News and Observer at newsobserver.com/subscribe and sign up for our weekly political newsletter, also called Under the Dome, at newsobserver.com/newsletters. Thanks for listening.